Everyone needs compassion, a love that's never failing. Let mercy fall on me. Everyone needs forgiveness, the kindness of a Savior, the hope of nations. Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, the author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. I won't go and miss the mornings. Sé que me There's nothing worth more that could ever come close. Nothing can compare. You're our living hope. Your presence, Lord. I've tasted and seen of the sweetest of loves, when my heart becomes free and my shame is undone. Your presence, Lord. Holy Spirit, you are welcome here. Come flood this place and fill the atmosphere. Your glory, God, is what our hearts long for. To be overcome by your presence, Lord. Your presence, there's nothing worth more that could ever come close. Nothing can compare. You're our living hope. Your presence, and I've tasted and seen of the sweetest of loves, when my heart becomes free and the shame is undone. It's by your presence, Lord. Holy Spirit, you are welcome here. Come flood this place and fill the atmosphere. Your glory, God, is what our hearts long for. To be overcome by your presence, Lord. Your presence, let us become more aware of your presence. Let us experience the glory of your goodness. Let us become more aware of your presence. Let us experience the glory of your goodness. Let us become more aware of your presence. Let us experience the glory of your goodness. Let us become more aware of your presence. Let us experience the glory of your goodness. Holy Spirit, you are welcome here. Come flood this place and fill the atmosphere. Your glory, God, is what our hearts long for. To be overcome by your presence, Lord.
Now I'm going to give you a warning. I'm going to offend some people. But what I'm going to say, I'm going to offend, and not because what I'm going to say is offensive, but because it's true. Good Sabbath, church. Pastor Helmer here, coming to you again in this way, in this format. I hope, I pray and I hope that you're taking advantage of these, that you're listening, that you're staying on top of them. More importantly, that they are things that you're considering, that things that you're learning from, lessons that I believe James is trying to teach us. I pray you guys are doing okay. Your faith continues to stay strong, that you're not faltering, and that you're unshaken where you stand. So today we continue our message in James. So if you open your Bibles to me in James chapter 1, verse 5 to 8. We're going to cover chapter 1 verses 5 through 8. So let's go there now. So just a recap of what's happened so far, what we did last week, what's going on so far, right? We touched last week that we touched on wisdom and how wisdom is separate from intelligence. I asked you the question: Have you ever met a smart dumb person? You asked, people that they give great advice, but they can't apply the advice to their personal life, right? So, and you see this, for some reason they give great advice, and for some reason you see this and you wonder why they give such great advice. How come they're not applying it to themselves? And last week's sermon, as we were moving through these verses, what we concluded, or what I stated, was wisdom is the application of knowledge. Wisdom is the application of our knowledge and our experiences to our own life and our situations. Usually when we speak of wisdom, it is gained from experience. We gain wisdom from experiences that we have, not just from reading it, right? You can be book smart, but you doesn't mean that it translates to something that is applicable to your daily life. I'm not saying it can't be, but in the way that we conduct ourselves, in the way we live our lives, right? It's something that you can read, but when you experience it and when you apply it is when it's true and real wisdom. Having the experience, it is learned behavior and applied. If we do not apply the wisdom that we learn, if we not apply the things that we're learning or that we're reading, then it's just knowledge. You are not a wise person, you're a knowledgeable person, which is completely different. If you knew better and you did it anyways, then you're the opposite of wise. Whatever adjective you want to add to describe that person. Or again, the person that gives great advice. While we appreciate the advice that they give and the words, right? Sometimes we are left with the idea of, why doesn't this person apply this to themselves? And it could be that sometimes, that although people know what is right and what is good, it is not always applied. Now, isn't that true? We know people that give good advice, that tell you not to do things. A drunk person that tells you not to drink. The person who is in an addiction and tells you, hey, don't get into that. While they are wise and true words, it's not applicable to themselves. But it is the application of the knowledge and the experiences to our daily lives that is wisdom. It is a tool needed. Wisdom is a tool needed in order to have the type of faith that verses 2, 3, and 4 are speaking about. Wisdom is a tool that is used to endure the difficult moments that we are living. The ones that James says, consider it all joy when you are going through difficult times. You are able to endure it. You're able to consider it joy when you have the wisdom to know that you are going through a trial in which God is forming you to become something special. A tool that God is using for your own perfection, your own telos. Verse 5 gives the specifics of this wisdom. that we might be lacking this wisdom in order to fulfill the idea of verse 2, 3, and 4. Verse 5 is what we use to fulfill the ideal. Remember, Proverbs 1:7 says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So this spiritual maturity, this endurance of trials, James tells us it begins with wisdom. Yet, if you are not in the ideal, if you still lack wisdom, James says, ask. And he repeats, he echoes the words of Jesus in Matthew 7:7. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. He will give you not just any wisdom. It's the wisdom that Proverbs 2:6 speaks about. For the Lord gives wisdom from his mouth. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. And verse 5, which is our verse where we begin the rest of the message today. James chapter 1 verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God. So if you lack it, if you lack wisdom, James says, ask for it. Ask for this tool. Ask for this essential instrument that is needed in order to fulfill the ideal. Ask. And look what happens when you ask. The verse says, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. If you ask for the wisdom that you need, he will give you the wisdom that you ask for. And he will give it to you generously. He will give it to you pasim, which means graciously. He will give it to you in bounty, bountiful. And without reproach, without criticism, without reprimand. He's not going to ask questions. If you ask, he's going to give it to you without asking. You know, kind of like when you ask your parents for money and they're like, what do you want it for? Well, I gave you money last week. He's not going to do that. He's not going to sit there and tap his finger and say, I don't know. He says if you ask, he'll give generously and he'll give without reproach. He will willingly give it to you. He won't say, like your parents, oh, that's too much money. I can't give you that much. I can't believe you don't have money. I gave you money. None of that. It'll be without reproach. He will give graciously. There is a willingness from God to give us, to give more, to provide the necessary tools and equipment so that you and I may reach the ideal. And it's a matter of asking. And now it's a matter quite possibly of people not asking. And the reason that people don't ask is because these people believe that they don't need. They are okay with their own wisdom. They are confident in the wisdom that they have and therefore don't need wisdom from above. So they don't ask of the wisdom from above. So they don't ask. Proverbs 3:7 says, be not wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. So the people that do not ask for wisdom, who are people who are self-sufficient in themselves, the book of Proverbs says, don't be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And turn away from evil. Meaning that if you are wise in your own eyes, you are not turning away from evil, you're embracing evil. Though, James shares something very intriguing with us. There's a condition, right? There's a way in which we should ask. There's a method. At verse 6, it begins and it says, but. Right, verse 5 says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. And in verse 6 says, but it's a conjunction. It's it's indicating that there is a condition. It's an exception. It's, I like you, but I think you're cute, but I'll lend you the money, but yeah, we're gonna go, but there's a condition. And James says, ask, but. And it says, but let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. So James says, let him ask with pistis. Let him ask with faith. Let him ask with strong confidence. Let him ask with reliance, complete assurance. Let him ask completely assured of who he is asking this from. So the condition is that when you ask, you need to ask in this fashion, in this way. You need to ask for wisdom without doubting God. He will give you the wisdom that you need if this is the way that you ask. You got to have faith that God is going to provide you with true wisdom, real wisdom. Faith and trust that God's wisdom is something that I need. It's something that is required for me to have to fulfill the ideal. So if you truly desire a godly faith, you have to ask. But you must ask in faith without doubting. Because if you doubt, it is indicative of something. It demonstrates a type of person that you are. It suggests something about you as a person. If you are this type of person that asks without faith, it demonstrates something about you as an individual, according to James. Look what James says in the latter part of the verse. But let him ask in faith with no doubt. Here it is. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. What does this mean exactly? The wind readily doesn't have a specific direction, right? It's a general direction that the wind blows sometimes. It blows as it pleases. It doesn't blow. It doesn't blow according to a specific path. It has a general direction that isn't specific, and it comes and it goes. It changes direction. The wind moves, and the wind moves the waves. So the waves also move according to the wind. So when it says that person who doubts is like a wave in the sea that is driven by the wind, because the wind drives the waves, and it comes and it goes. The waves come and go. The waves go and they come and they crash and they rise and they fall. The waves are inconsistent. The only consistent thing about the waves is that they rise and fall. I'm going to take it a little further. A person with this mentality who asks without faith is also in danger. It is dangerous to be this type of person. The uncertainty and doubt of a person can lead a person to a dangerous place in their life, away from God, in a place of faithlessness. A person who has no faith when he asks, this type of person will be in a place that is further away from God, not nearer to God. Every time we pray, when we ask, when Luke says, if those of you that desire the Holy Spirit, ask. When you want faith, James says ask, but we have to ask with faith. So when we ask these things, we have to ask knowing that we cannot doubt the idea, or we cannot doubt that God has the possibility, the capability, or that God wants to bless us with faith, with wisdom, with understanding. So we must ask these things. Ephesians 4:14, then we will no longer be infants, tossed about the waves and carried around by every wind of teaching and by clever cunning of men in their deceitful scheming. Meaning that a person who is carried to and from like the waves that James is speaking about, this person is infantile in the faith. This person is an infant in the faith. They are immature. They are what Paul calls them. Paul calls them immature. They calls them infants. Those that ask without faith. And look what happens. There is a consequence to this person. There is a consequence to this type of person. 7 says, for that person, the person that is unstable, that person that is a person of doubt, the person that is like the wave, that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. This is, church, this is such an important verse. Because it's going to dismiss so many ideologies that we have. The idea that people feel as though God gives or God owes or God is supposed to, or that God gives to anyone. As though God simply gives just because you said a prayer once and then you were having a hard time because you were having a hard time, but the rest of your life is in shambles. You're living whatever life you want to live, and a lot of people believe simply because they said one prayer, all of a sudden God owes or God has to give, right? Let me put it into perspective as to why this is important. And I'm going to give 2 examples. Now I'm going to give you a warning. I'm going to offend some people. By what I'm going to say, I'm going to offend, not because what I'm going to say is offensive, but because it's true. It's going to disrupt a lot of ideologies that we have and a lot of things that people say or have said, or maybe that you possibly believe. So I'm warning you ahead of time. See, we as a church, we've seen people pass away. Maybe within the church or maybe outside of the church, or family members that we have. We have heard people say the following. Such person is in a better place, or he's with the angels now, or I know he's in heaven, or I know this individual is in a place that is better, knowing very well the lifestyle of the individual, that the lifestyle that the person lived was a person that demonstrated that there was no faith in God. Certainly not the type of faith that James is speaking about. But the truth of the matter is that James says that God doesn't owe you anything. That's what the verse says. He says, must not suppose that that person who doesn't ask in faith, who doesn't have faith when they believe, that person cannot suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. So James is saying, what James is saying is that God doesn't owe you anything. If God will not give you wisdom unless you have faith, what makes you think he will give you something even greater than wisdom, such as salvation? How can God give you something that is greater and bigger than salvation? How can God give you wisdom when there is no faith? When you're not asking in faith, God will not give you wisdom. And where do you get off that you think that because you said a prayer, or because you simply said something once, one time, because you were having a hard time, but the rest of your life is the same, you think that God is going to give you something, that you're actually, that person or those individuals are somewhere in a better place, as if though God owes, and God doesn't owe us anything. And 2, this is the common question, and you've heard this. Why is God doing this to me? Is this what God wanted, or how come God doesn't? Right? We hear this all the time. Like, do you think God, or why is it that God, but I prayed once, even though I've been living my life faithless. But I said a prayer once, and how come God? And James says that person who does not ask in faith. Listen, the person who has doubt, who is wishy-washy, who rises and falls in their faith, the person who is here and there and sometimes over there, the one that doesn't ask with certainty of the Lord, that person, James says, may not suppose that he will receive anything from God. God doesn't owe you anything. if you are faithless. And I assure you that James is not referring to a faith where you simply express what you believe, but a faith where it is indicative by the way that you live that you have faith. It is because of this, because many people believe that just a simple faith of expressing that it is enough, that God owes, that God must, that He should. This is the reason many people lose hope. Why many people wonder where God is, or why didn't He answer? Why would God? No, not why would God do this? Why would you do this? God doesn't owe you anything. Listen, and let me take it even further. God doesn't even owe us anything who are believers and have faith. But He made promises that He holds Himself to those who choose to believe and who walk in faith and who act in wisdom. He, by His own words, has committed Himself by what He expressed to bless those who walk in faith. But James says, if you do not have faith, if you do not ask in faith, if you do not walk in faith, God owes you nothing. In plain English, James says, God does not owe you anything. But to those who have faith, God has given promises. 2 Peter 1:3, His divine power, God's divine power, has granted to us all things that pertain to this life, the blessings of the life that we live in the flesh, and godliness, the life of godliness that we need to follow, through the knowledge of Him in Christ, who called us to His own glory and His own excellence. We are blessed and we are called to glory and to excellence by the knowledge of Jesus Christ. And has been granted to us all the things that pertain to this life and to the next. Church, and this is such an important idea that we have to remember and consider, that God doesn't owe you anything just because one time you decided to do something and all of a sudden you're angry at God, but the rest of your life you haven't lived accordingly. God has no obligation. Here, let me put it to you in this way. Imagine the neighbor's son comes to your house and says, "Hey, where's my Christmas present?" Not your son, the neighbor's son, that you barely know. You just know him. You've seen him walk in and out. He says hi to you and maybe to your son or your daughter. But the neighbor's son comes to your house and says, "Hey, where's my Christmas gift?" Do you owe the kid a Christmas gift? Or let's say a birthday gift? No. Why not? You have no obligation to that child. He's not yours. He doesn't even talk to you. You have no relationship with him. If there's no relationship, there is no commitment. There is no obligation. But if it's your son's birthday, the one that you do have an obligation with, the one that you do love, that you have a relationship with, a connection with, that you walk with and talk with, even though you don't have to, there is sort of a commitment that for a special event like his birthday, you will buy him something. Possibly out of commitment and out of love. But if there's no relationship like the neighbor's kid, there is no obligation. So to those who pray without faith, it is indicative that there is no relationship. And if there is no relationship, there is no obligation from God. Look, verse 8 to finish. This person that asks without faith, the one whose faith rises and falls, he is a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. Understand that James is talking about a specific type of person here, okay? He's talking about a very specific type of person. A person that asks God for something without faith. That's who James is talking about in these 3 verses, 5, 6, 7, 8. In these 4 verses. James is specifically talking about an individual that is asking God for something without faith. James says this person is double-minded. He's dipsychos. This person is characterized by the duality of the self and his desire and his thinking that are opposite to each other. He's double-minded. He lacks decisiveness. He doesn't know what he or she wants. Look, think about it for a second. Just think about this for a second. People pray without faith. James is saying it happens. And you've seen it happen. Sometimes people just pray because they just pray. And a lot of people pray without faith. Yes? Really sit back and think about what I just said. Take a second to think about this. People pray to God, or they pray to a God that they don't know, that they've never gotten to know. And they ask of him even though there's no relationship. And they have no relationship with him, but yet they ask. So how is it that they're asking God or their concept of God without being completely convinced of who they are asking? As though God is supposed to just give to them when they desire, when they get to it and come around and ask him, and God is just going to give just because he decided to ask, just for asking. A person who is praying without faith is a contradiction in terms. Let me say that again. A person who is praying without faith, without trust, without understanding, without no doubt, is a contradiction in terms. If you do not believe in whom and to whom you are praying to, then who are you praying to? And if you don't believe in the person that you're praying to or in the entity that you're praying to, if you are not completely convinced in who you're praying to, then why are you praying? And do you believe what you're doing? Look, I know, right? I know, and I believe wholeheartedly that there are times when people are at the end of their rope. When there's no other way out, and in the back of their minds, they remember God. And a lot of times, he's the last straw. He's the last solution. And they kneel. And he's all they have left. And they kneel and they begin to pray to a God that is foreign to them. But in the back of their minds, there is a understanding that there is something greater. I understand that. And I believe that God uses those moments. And those who genuinely have that moment go on to believe, to become very strong believers. Because God has used that moment to bring them to him. But there's a lot of people who pray only when they are suffering these moments. That is not the faith that James is requiring for us to have. So what do we say today? Well, if you notice, verse 2, 3, and 4 were the ideal of this, how to be joyous in the time of tribulation and difficulty. That's the ideal that we're striving for. That's what we're working towards. And then verse 5 says, but in case you're not at the ideal, you got to ask for wisdom, right? You got to ask for wisdom. So we're given a tool that we need. We're given wisdom that we need to ask for. So we need to ask for wisdom. And then James throws another one at us and he says, you got to have faith. You got to really truly believe and be convinced that when you ask, that God is going to give it to you, so that when you kneel and you are convinced and you have no doubt that God is going to give you wisdom, God will give you wisdom. So we have wisdom, and now we have faith that we are in need of. And I know some of you are saying, well, I don't have wisdom and my faith is lacking. You don't need a lot of it. Jesus said you just need a little bit. A very small amount. If you see yourself as an individual who desires wisdom, who desires to have wisdom, then you must ask, and you must ask in a fashion in which you have no doubt that God is going to give you wisdom. You have to believe, you have to begin to trust. And I know, like, how do I develop this faith? What is it that I gotta do to in order for me to have this faith? What must I do to have this faith? And the truth is, church, the best way to have trust in an individual, the best way to get to know someone and begin to trust someone, the best way to really begin to have a relationship with someone and then you begin to trust that person is to spend time with them. There is no better way. The reason you have friends that you trust with your life, like no matter what happens, you have their back and they have yours. And the reason that you guys are friends is because of the experiences that you have and the time that you spend together that help you develop that relationship with that individual. It's not much different with God when it comes to your faith. The amount of faith that we have indicates the amount of time we spend with Him. Yeah? The amount of faith that someone has that is visible, that we can see, that you have, that you know. The amount of faith that sometimes we can even tell that people have faith. When that amount of faith, when we see it, it indicates the amount of time they spend with God. In prayer, in song, in worship, in teaching and learning. We are to ask for wisdom. We are to ask it with faith, church. But in order to have that small mustard seed of faith, we must spend time with Him to further and continually develop that faith that we have. We had almost a year of not going to church, of not going to work for some, and we've been given the gift of time. I pray you spend time with Him. I pray that you're coming out of this with greater faith and therefore wisdom. May the Lord bless you and keep you until we congregate again. Pasamos.